Okay, we're going to make a start. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. I can see colleagues from different parts of the world, from Singapore mainly, but also colleagues from Australia and the UK and other places. So I think we're going to make a start. If this is your first time of attending the EOS seminar webinar series, the EOS seminar series or seminar research, or indeed the EOS research cluster, JCU Singapore, was formed earlier on this year, and our interest is to engage with research that cuts between the boundaries of business and society. So we seek to understand how firms are governed, how firms are held accountable, how firms contribute to the society and to the global socioeconomic health and vitality. So we also take a very multidisciplinary approach to understanding this sense of ethics and corporate governance and CSR and sustainability. And we look at, accounting, finance, theology, philosophy type literature in engaging and interrogating this concept. So we're very delighted to be hosting Associate Professor Konan Seny Kan today. And before I formally introduce Anderson Seny Kan, I'm just going to say a few words about the expectations. So the webinars, as always, will be recorded for publicity purposes, and you will be able to ask questions at any point of the webinar. However, that will be true using the Q&A function. So the Q&A function will be visible to me and our very august presenter. And of course, it could be answered during the presentation itself or at the end of the presentation. If I feel that the question has already been answered in the course of the presentation, I'll probably click that it's been answered, and then we'll be left with questions that are meant to be answered. At the end, there will be the Q&A session proper, and there will be a satisfaction poll and survey that I would like you to also engage with at the end. If you experience any technical difficulty, you're not able to hear us, or you're not able to use the chat function or the Q&A function, please let us know by indeed using the chat button, and that way we'll be communicating with the event organizers. So without further ado, I'm going to quickly introduce our speaker today. Our speaker today is Konan Anderson Seny Kan, who is Associate Professor at Grenoble École de Management in France. Prior to that, he was lecturing at Otago Business School in New Zealand, and he obtained his PhD from Toulouse School of Management, University Toulouse I capital in France. Previously, before going to New Zealand, Anderson also worked at Toulouse Business School in France, where I was also visiting professor for a considerable amount of time. So Anderson and I have worked on several projects, and the paper that's going to be presented today is one of our ongoing research. However, his research is at the crossroad of three key themes, which are accounting and governance and CSR on the one hand, and another is the organizations, which includes, if you like, multinationals, emerging economies on the one hand, and also configural thinking. And his published works in the African Management Studies, in the CPA, Critical Perspectives on Accounting. He's published in the European Management Journal, Harvard Business Review, Information Technology and People, Journal of Business Ethics, Journal of Business Research. One of our papers in the Journal of Business Research is one of the quite heavily cited paper in the journal. So Anderson is a very good friend, very dear friend of mine of more than a decade, and I'm very happy to welcome you to JCU Singapore, Anderson, and the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you for this, for this introduction, Emmanuel. And it's really good to see you here online. And it's really good to, to contribute to this very wonderful platform. So from now, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so this one. share. Good. So you can hear me, right?
Yes, indeed.
Absolutely. So, yeah, the title of the presentation here is A New Model for Corporate Governance in Developing Countries, which has a bit of link with the introduction that, Emmanuel gave. So, the idea is to question the well-established way of thinking of corporate governance, and from there, having some ways to really think of corporate governance at the service of developing countries, because more and more what we are doing as researcher is kind of assess against the impact that we have. So not only we are producing a kind of intellectual assets, but we now want make sure that what we are producing can benefit our different societies. So I would say this is a bit of starting point of the paper. And then also, as Emmanuel said, a part of the paper is ongoing. And I think the presentation here will have some additional insights because we are still developing the paper. So this is the outline of the presentation. The first 3 points will set the ground of the reflection that we have. So on the first point, I'm going to discuss a little bit this idea of corporate governance as a concept, but also as a movement. And the second point we'll discuss, demonstrate this idea that every management concept is kind of challenged because of its hegemonic type of features, which prevent some of the researchers to really, contextualize what they're doing. So I'll be using Sub Saharan Africa as the example, an example of settings, developing country settings to illustrate what we demonstrate in the paper. And in terms of modeling, we locate the modeling of the model within some very specific theoretical background that I'll be presenting. And then I'll finish the presentation on the contribution/implication, which means, so probably those contributions can trigger some collaboration for other aspects of the idea. So on the first element here, what I want to discuss quickly, it is something that I think people that are researchers that are accustomed to corporate governance knows, is that corporate governance as a concept is kind of developed within developed countries, and progressively we can see that there was some attempts to connect corporate governance to development. So we can clearly see on the website of OECD the objective of corporate governance when it comes to development within developing countries. So they're saying that corporate governance in developing and transition economies is to build functional institutions for sustainable private sector. So clearly we can see the objective of that is to develop a very specific aspect of, the society within developing and transition economies. And actors involved in this corporate governance are, the well-known international financial institutions like, the World Bank and multilateral donors and bilateral donors. And there is an implicit assumption in the understanding of corporate governance as a vehicle where we can sustain organization, and organization in turn will contribute to wealth creation for the society. So the idea of wealth creation here is a kind of synonymous with the idea of development, I guess. So this is an important starting point. So, but this idea of connecting corporate governance to development is not that easy, because we can observe that even within the part of the world where corporate governance idea is coming from, corporates are still failing, right? So I'm not saying that the failures are only within the developed, but also within the developing country, we observe that. But still, the idea is that those failures are due to the low quality of corporate governance in the setting where the failures are happening. So it is not the concept itself that is questioned the way it was devised, but it is simply the quality of it. A paper in GBE published by Reed in 2002 was really interesting in trying to trace back the origin of the notion of corporate governance, but also the origin of development. So the idea here is that development itself also is conceived from the proponent of corporate governance as a concept. So as a concept, we can observe a kind of evolution of its understanding. One of the evolution was that corporate governance development was in the past understood as industrialization. And then scholars start realizing, and practitioners realizing that development is not all about industrialization. We have to consider social, cultural, political. And then in the end, we end up having a connection between corporate governance and development as a normative prescription. Okay, so so what we can observe is that corporate governance is playing different roles. So within the setting of failure of companies, corporate governance can be seen as a remedy of corporate failures, but at the same time, it can also be seen as a development medium. But with this paper of Mess in Journal of Management History, we can also learn that corporate governance was set up as an academic field. So as an academic field, the concept as a kind of hegemonic type of feature where everything that was said about corporate governance coming from the developed countries should be seen as a global theory. And so if it's global, it means that it is not context bounded and it's also time free. So which means that we can apply it elsewhere. So which might pose some questions. It is the same thing that a very recent paper published in Business and Society by Zaman and Gophers put forward here. Most of the model that we know are coming from developed nations, and in the non-developed countries or non-Anglo-Saxon countries, corporate governance is also a matter of institutional pressures. So it is not something that is natural, it is kind of imposed upon other parts of the world. So this is to just make a recap. So if we make a recap of this way of viewing corporate governance, is a concept, is a movement, but it's also, it has some normative features, empirical description, and causal theories inside it as a knowledge production, a tool. But what is really difficult in challenging corporate governance is that corporate governance has some strong argument in it. The idea that a good articulation of control and management is key to sustain organizations. It's kind of plausible, it's something that everyone can understand. But then there is some of the weak argument within the narrative on corporate governance, which is this idea of imposing the same model in different contexts, which makes it a little bit weaker in that sense. So for this paper, for the reflection that we have, what we are seeing is that for developing countries, our ultimate objectives, especially with regard to the impact of our research, should be development of the so-called developing countries. So we want to make a research, we want to understand the functioning of our society to make sure that we are contributing to the development. And our understanding of development is multidimensional in the sense that it's not only an industrialization type of development, it is a combination of human development, institutional improvement, institution improvement, sustainability development. So this also question researchers regarding their position to society. What do we want? Are we doing a research for the sake of publishing, or are we doing our research to impact our society? I think the position that we are taking in this paper is that a researcher should go beyond, the managerial perspective of its own intellectual production to contribute to a wider society. So from there, once we say that as a concept, corporate governance as a concept with its normative philosophy is like any kind of management concept, which has some alternatives. So we locate the reflection in a broad alternative in management ideas, and the idea is to what extent the idea of corporate governance captures all priorities in the developing countries and priorities in developed countries. It might be a little difficult. So how we locate this literature? So we locate our conversation within the literature of Global South. Global South is a really powerful literature to understand how we can, developing countries, scholars, or those are interested in developing countries can voice their understanding of how we should, manage our society. So this is gonna take a form of hybridism type of, intellectual contribution, but also the necessary identity negotiation within, the research that we are doing. So we are locating our reflection on this, global setting narrative. Now, the title of the presentation is Modeling Corporate Governance for Developing Countries. So what we did is that we target Sub-Saharan Africa as an example of developing setting. So now we're going to tap into some of the recent and ongoing debate that we have on developing Sub-Saharan Africa, especially with the very notion of African management. So we're going to see what makes a context particular, especially Sub-Saharan Africa, and how we can build on that to frame, a corporate governance. So Emmanuel and I co-authored a paper in 2015 in Society and Business Review in the starting of this journey, questioning precisely this notion of African management, and trying to understand the usability of the concept, both in terms of research but also in terms of practice. Practice means here the influence that we can have on some policies. That literature has expanded so far. So what we can really understand in this literature is that we really need to contextualize the context within which we are investigating, we are doing our research, because it is the only way to contribute to the entire society. And interestingly, we can build on some of the modeling in African management that we have. So we have Zuga and co-authors who model the African management, putting forward this idea that the context within the developing country, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, is marked by what they call institutional dualism. I'm going to explain that. And then I'll be probably, expand a little bit on another modeling of African management, which is the power relationship within which developing countries are due to the historical, path dependencies. So if you take the paper of Zuga and Goffer, what they said is that the developing countries have a specific context, and the context is marked by an attempt of modernization, but at the same time, we have traditional things that's still there, traditional way of doing things that's still there. And inside that, we have formal way of interacting, but also informal. And sometimes formal and informal can contradict or can conflict. So this makes the context particular. And I think in addition to that is the work of Terence Jackson and co-authors, who say that we cannot discuss management in those settings without understanding the global dependencies of developing countries, especially like Africa. A very interesting paper that they published in Journal World Business in the context of Kenya illustrate this idea of power relationship even on management context like corporate governance or African management like that. So we need to consider the features of the context when it comes to discuss an idea that was developed and that was linked to the development of societies. So key features here are that developing countries have dual institutional settings. We have a combination of formal, informal, and we also have some power relationship, meaning that the decision made in those settings are not the sole will of actors there. They are also pressured by other people to make certain type of decisions. So in a very recent paper that we published in CPA, we also put forward this idea through the notion of African polycentricity. So let's make a recap here. So what we can understand is that developing countries have a particular settings with the combination of actors within different jurisdiction of decision, but they overlap, right? So this is the very polycentric characteristic of developing countries, but also this polycentric characteristic of developing countries has some power relationship that we cannot ignore anymore if our research is to have an impact and if we want to understand clearly what is going on. And the ultimate objective, I think, is a position that we can discuss, but we think that one of the objectives of our research should be the development of this part of the world So I'm not saying that developed countries don't need, some development issues, but clearly well-being of people within the developing countries is a serious issue that we have to address together. So again, what we want to do is to really to contribute to the development as an ultimate objective of the research that we are doing. So from there, how did we reflect on uh, let's say the challenges that we are putting on the very generic notion of corporate governance and the new model that we're trying to reflect on. So we anchored our reflection on the so-called multi-theory approach. So I'm going to present the two approaches or theories that we use to, organize our ideas. So the first approach is for those who are really used to corporate governance literature is what we call a multi-level corporate governance, especially this very notion of uh, governance, national corporate governance bundles. The idea is that starting corporate governance at either the firm level or at a macro level is not sufficient anymore, because in reality, the behavior of organizations depends on the macro level settings. So we have some literature that is there, extensive literature, and even a special issue published in CGIR in 2015. So we have, some knowledge that is there that we can tap into to, build our argument. So what we're trying to say is that if the national corporate governance bundles assumptions are right, then we really need to consider that in the context of developing country too. And then how can we articulate the connection between the macro level and the firm level dimension of corporate governance? This is where we use the very notion of governance, governmentality, which is an idea brought by a French philosopher called Michel Foucault, with this idea that it is the conduct is the way to organize, human action in activities, and it's a way of problematizing, a specific settings with special questionings here: who can govern, what governing is, and what and who is governed. So what we did is that we expand on that by using Dean framework. Dean called this the regime of practices. For Dean, the idea of governmentality is kind of, develop governable subject, governable settings with four major pillars. The first one is the form of visibility that the process of governing provide, especially the kind of problem that we have to solve and the objective to be sought. So as I said earlier, our position is that it's development with its multi dimensions. And then what are the technical means, technical tools that we have at hand, or authorities have at hand to conduct the way they govern, and also to make sure that people are applying rules that are there. And then we have a third dimension, which is the rationality of the people within the settings. So it's clear that the rationality in the United States is different in the rationality in, East Asia, or, in Asia, and also in Africa, for instance. So rationality of people is really important in the way we can devise such important thing as, corporate governance. And also the ethos is the last dimension of this idea of governmentality. Is what are the form of identities of people within a setting through which, the authorities operate, and also practice and programs are put forward to, coordinate action of human beings. So these are the two theoretical lenses. So to make a recap, so we're using corporate governance, national corporate governance bundles, and governmentality as a way to cement the interaction between the macro level and the firm level governance. So we end up having a framework like that. So I'm going to spend a bit of time on this part of the presentation because I think this is key in what we want to demonstrate and the discussion that we want to have. So we believe from what I said earlier that a good understanding of the way we can articulate the functioning of organization for them to serve the purpose of development, so human development, a structural change, sustainable development, and the other fourth dimension of development, as we need to understand how we can articulate that. So the functioning of a society is embedded in this regime of practices with its four pillars: the form of visibility, meaning the type of problems that we have to address and the objective of the entire society. So, and also the means, the technical means that we have, the identities of people uh, in the settings, and also um, the thought process of people, right? So what is the starting point of the model? The starting point is here in the middle is the nation state institutions. So what we see is that institutions are really important, but nation state, especially institutions in developing countries, free market doesn't really exist. So we need powerful, states that can articulate the functioning of key stakeholders, like the way capital is mobilized, the way labor is organized, and the way management are handling the functioning of organization. And in this model, what is important is that we extracted verbs from management because of the informality that we have within those settings. And also, one key element that we identify in developing setting is the ethnicities, which is a core characteristic of developing countries. So nationhood is something, but ethnicity is kind of much more stronger than nationhood. So people identities can be expressed through the ethnicities within those settings. So here you can clearly see that what we're trying to do, we're trying to develop an idea where the overarching questioning of corporate governance might look like, how practice of corporate governance in developing country is make thinkable and practical. So this idea is to renew the way of problematizing the relationship between organization and society. So from there, what kind of contribution we're trying to bring with this way of modeling, introducing new things. So um, I'm making a reference to, I'm referring here to Mark Doak in 2018. They published a really interesting paper in SMG regarding how we can make a theoretical contribution. So I'm using this to frame a little bit of contribution of the framework that we are presenting here. So first of all, one of the major contribution is a revisit of a reframe of the overarching corporate governance questioning. So because question is key for theory development. So the idea is to what degree developing country corporate governance captures development priorities. I think is a very important question for we as a researcher interested in corporate governance in these settings. And so the research question is a very important input in the contribution that we can make. Then we have different levels of contribution. The first one is the mode of theorization that we are expecting from this modeling. So we need to have a kind of appropriate balance between the stock of knowledge that already exists, because corporate governance is a kind of mature type of research theme. So we have a lot of knowledge, stock of knowledge that is there that we can dig to really grasp what is important, what is appropriate. But at the same time, we really need to develop a kind of context-specific knowledge on the setting of the research to make sure that we understand the visibilities, the problems that are there, so that we can, render issues, challenges visible, so that we can think of how we can find some remedies to that. So I think it's a really important contribution of what we are doing here. A second level of contribution of theorization that can come out of our framework is the level of analysis. So now on, we want to see a much more discussion around how we can combine developing country settings, macro level settings, and the organizational level settings to clearly understand the articulation between the behavior of organization and the decision that people are making on top of those, countries or settings. So I think it's really important, which means that the firm level organization, firm level type of research in corporate governance is good, but it is something that have been done, over and over. So I think we can move on to really integrate the, those levels. And then we have a third level of, contribution, which is the causal mechanism that we're trying to, approach here. We are not saying that we are discovering the causal mechanism or functioning of corporate governance within developing countries, but the framework is helpful, to gear us toward this, kind of contribution. So what we're doing here is that we are questioning the causal capacity of the extent misconceptualization of corporate governance within developing countries. So once we have a way to frame, how we can put the extent corporate governance into question, then we can really contribute on the causal mechanism of the functioning and the role of the organization, the role assigned implicitly to the organization in the development of the society. A fourth level of contribution is on the construct itself. So what we're trying to do here, we're trying to stress on the local context, the local idiosyncrasies of the context, mainly with this some very important characteristics. So I put informalities and ethnicity, but it's not only that. So it's something that probably have to delay. So basically, we're trying to target the labor and the production process. A large part of the labor and the production process within developing countries are informal, while at the very inception of corporate governance, coming from the United States, the production process was much more formal. So we can see a bit of tension, a bit of difference here, and we are also targeting individual and collective identities. So ethnicities in these developing settings is really important. So it is a notion that we are introducing here. The idea of institutional dualism is really important, or dual institutionalism, and the idea that we should also have a position as a researcher to really understand that the settings that we are investigating has some priorities, and for us, the most important priorities are the development of those countries with the four dimensions that I presented. And in terms of, so we have a fifth level of contribution, which is questioning the boundary condition of the extant corporate governance. So we're trying to expose some of the hidden assumptions. So one of the assumptions is that corporate governance should be linked to development, but this is now we see in everyday papers that are publishing even in top tier journals, right? So I think the ongoing research is kind of perpetuating the managerial perspective of organization with and overlooking the role of organization within society. So also the internal inadequacies and inconsistencies of the extant literature. And in the end, what is let's say the ultimate output of this way of framing our contribution and also devising this corporate governance notion is that we're trying to have a clear description, right? So what is said is that the failure to explain things is simply because we fail to describe the object of research. So what we're providing here, we're not saying that it is something without any kind of criticism, but I think it's a good starting point to start questioning what is really important to some of our empirical settings, so some of the environment that we're trying to investigate. So not only we want to contribute to research, but we also want to contribute to those contexts. So description is really important within this framework, but I think along the line, explanation could be something, an objectives, an intellectual objective that we can, target. So typically here, what we are providing is to rephrase the overarching research question, find a new way to problematize the organization and society relationship. And the ultimate, let's say, outcome for now is, it can be phrased in that way. So people well-being is a function of development need fulfillment, which is largely dependent on accurate governmentalization of national corporate governance bundles. So this is where we locate, let's say, the conversation around the role that corporate governance can play in development. And clearly, this combines the theoretical framework that we are providing, but also some of the characteristic of um, developing countries. For sure, we used Sub Saharan Africa as an example, but it is something that is kind of can be applied to different developing country settings. In the paper that is ongoing and under revision, we expand on that a little bit. So I think I spent 30 minutes, so probably I'm gonna leave a bit of room for a discussion. Thank you very much. This is the core idea that we have here. It is ongoing research project. We are still developing, so all your feedback are more than welcome. And again, thank you, Emmanuel and his team, and thank you to GCU for the opportunity to share, our ongoing reflection.
Thank you very much, Anderson. I think that was a very thorough, very concise, nonetheless, presentation. And perhaps it's also useful to say that the paper is currently under review in critical perspectives on accounting. So we welcome feedback, we welcome questions and queries and, if you like, critiques of it. So thank you very much. If I may start to just get the ball rolling, Anderson.
Mm-hmm.
So if we reflect generally on corporate governance in developing countries and how that literature has emanated, and given the goal of EOS and looking at contributions of different fields. So in this current paper, we seem to have looked at things theoretically, methodologically, but also we've engaged with different sort of fields that have contributed to the corporate governance literature. So I just wonder how you would describe this paper. I know it's in the CPA, for instance, but how is this an accounting paper, for instance, to start with, and if you may reflect more broadly on the interdisciplinary contributions to corporate governance studies.
Yeah, thank you very much for this first question. I'll say I think the paper is built as an interdisciplinary product of our reflection, right? So I think we can locate for that reason the paper in different kind of discussion, right? So it can be a discussion in a critical perspective, or let's say critical management research, for instance, right? Or it can also be in critical perspective on accounting. Why it makes sense to try CPA, for instance, with this paper? It is simply because, as you can see, it is a kind of holistic way of viewing the role of organization with society, right? And corporate governance as a management concept. So if you view corporate governance as a management concept, then accounting is also, let's say, a subset of management. Therefore, it makes sense. It can also inform some of the accounting research that we have there, right? So the same as management research, accounting research is also much more about a replication, except for the interdisciplinary type of accounting research. So I think it makes sense, to have it in CPA, but clearly the paper is an holistic perspective. It can contribute to different type of discussion. Yeah.
Thank you very much. If we move a little bit away from the theoretical perspective, so many of some of our audiences are practitioners as well.
Yeah.
So would you reflect on some of the practitioner take-home lessons from these thoughts we're having, ranging from problematizing the relationship between governance and these institutional context, but in terms of being a board director, being a government regulator, putting together a corporate governance code, well, what do you think are the immediate things that they can reflect on?
So I think the immediate one is that once policymakers are reflecting on what they want to put in place within settings, they really need to consider what is essential or what is at the core of the society within which they want to develop their policies, right? So I understand that due to some kind of, historical trajectory of developing countries, they have a close, link, with some international counterparts. But even the international counterpart, they need to understand that the way they perceive how we can organize our society cannot function if we don't really consider what is core in those, settings. So I think for practitioners and policymakers, trying to develop, articulate a functioning of the institution that really consider what is core in the society is the first takeaway that we need to have here. And then I think the framework also is tapping into this kind of a dual jurisdiction that we had in every developing countries. In my own country, which is Cote d'Ivoire, for instance, when you are at the capital, you feel like all the country looks at the capital, but only a few kilometers away from the capital, you are in the rural area where rules of the capital probably doesn't, don't apply there anymore. So we have this, dual jurisdiction that need to be considered. So I think for policymakers, they also need to think of what has been done in, let's say, in developing countries. For instance, in Africa, we know that Ghana did well in trying to combine formal and informal set of rules. We also know that, for instance, in South Africa, the corporate governance includes some of the core, social features of their society, like Ubuntu, for instance. So there are some examples of how we can mingle formalized thing and local, aspect of the settings to devise something that is functional. So I would say, yeah, this can help policymakers to really have a kind of framework to reflect the way they want to improve their settings.
Thank you. I think that's very important to say. I'm on the IOD committee currently putting together the corporate governance code for Ghana. And one of the things we also ensuring is that local specificity and to tackle local problems. So I think that's very important. I suppose, and it's good you talked about South Africa and Ghana, Kenya. I'm wondering, in the paper, we did mention that we're not taking Africa or Sub Saharan Africa, for that matter, as an homogeneous sample, and that we recognize diversity even within this space. But how applicable will our model be in terms of, particularly looking at the ethnicity in the whole of Sub Saharan Africa? And what sort of further contextualization will be necessary to make it work?
Oh, I think this is a really important question, right? Because ethnicity itself as a concept is, you have a lot of things there, right? So we really need to understand what is Sub-Saharan ethnicity, how it works. Is there any kind of, differences in the entire Sub-Saharan? If you read some of the literatures which are not in management organization literature, things are really interesting there. So people are saying that beyond, the apparent diversity of Sub-Saharan Africa, actually we have a kind of common, cultural features, right? So I think if we can dig the particularities of that ethnicity in different regions of Sub-Saharan, then we can go deeper in the understanding of, the functioning of the society. For instance, if you take the example of Mali, some of the scholars are saying that the problem that we have in Mali is a problem, an ethnicity problem, right? A part of the ethnic group in Mali are feeling like they are prevented to, access power. So those who were frustrated, were kind of inclined to, to challenge, those are in power. But it looks like it's a kind of, this situation has a bit of, ethnic type of background. So some people are contesting that, but it is one of the discussion that is, going on. So I think, but also this will be really helpful because this can help us dig into our African humanities to understand how we want to develop our continent, because we cannot develop an entire continent, a rich continent, right? With the humanities of others. right? So I think this is the opportunity. I think the opportunity to dig into what the humanities of Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa is, and what are the key features of that humanities, and then incorporate that in the modeling of the ethnicity. I think. So for now, I would say I don't have a straightforward answer,
Well,
but we have to dig that literature, right? We have to dig
yes,
the African
indeed.
humanities literature to inform, what we're
Mhm.
doing.
Absolutely, and I'm sure you're quite familiar with our works on Afro-capitalism and that sort of
Yeah,
thing.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah,
And our last presenter was Kenneth
yeah,
Amechi, who talked in Afro-capitalism.
yeah.
So thanks for
Uh,
those insights. I've got a question here
yeah.
from Professor Barty.
Mhm,
So what are your thoughts on implementing corporate governance and CSR? So we're now getting into both literatures. What are your thoughts on
mhm,
implementing corporate governance and CSR in developing countries? So that's on the one hand, versus the argument of being discriminated by
yeah.
the developed world in terms of the
Mhm,
unsustainable practices. I suppose this question is reflecting on how can corporate governance help CSR prevent some of the unsustainable practices uh,
mhm,
uh, within the Sub-Saharan Africa versus these being maybe done externally by developed countries, especially because we talked about these transnational institutions and World Bank and etc., and maybe the
yeah.
transplantation of governance standards developed in other jurisdictions and how
Mhm,
these either aid or undermine the corporate governance structure's ability to use CSR as a
mhm.
tool to prevent unsustainable practices.
So I think this is a really interesting question, right? So I don't know if you remember, I presented one of the very recent paper published by Zaman, Jean, Zamara, and Jamali in
Mhm.
Business and Society. They are exactly responding to that question. So for them, they think that corporate governance has matured now enough to be connected to CSR. So they presented a framework where corporate governance can be connected to CSR, viewing CSR as a much more overarching type of
Mhm.
concept in comparison with corporate governance. But probably it's also an understanding that probably corporate governance failed to meet the assigned objective to it, right? So then we are turning into this idea of CSR. But again, we have to be careful here because even the CSR topic, it is something that was brought from from the western part of the world, from those who were proposing corporate governance at the first place, right? So I think the connection here is on the idea that we fail to really recognize that corporate governance was at the service of organization, and then organization were at the service of the development. So now we want to make sure that organization can be not only at their own service, but also at the service of the society. So by broadening our understanding of corporate governance, then we can capture some of the features of sustainable, let's call CSR, right? Uh, because the decision parameters are not only board of directors, so it is the entire society, civil society, the biodiversity, human development, which correspond a little bit to the definition of development that we have here in this paper, all right? So I would say the connection between corporate governance and CSR is that uh, corporate governance starts to be seen as a subset of CSR, which means that CSR is responding to some of the failures of the first conceptualization of corporate governance. I hope that I provide, convincing answer here.
Thank you. I think it's a very tricky interlink. I think
Yeah,
some people take the view that uh, CSI is probably within corporate governance,
yeah,
and some people
mhm,
take the other view. So
yeah,
that's very interesting. Thank you.
mhm,
Another question is, how do we relate this to public sector governance? Because obviously, if we are talking about sub-Saharan Africa, we have
yeah,
significant issues even within public sector governance,
mhm,
and
mhm,
even countries that have democracy, the quality of democracy, and that sort of thing. So,
mhm,
what insights can you share for public sector governance, or indeed, um, state governance?
yeah,
In,
yeah.
in,
I
in
think, yeah, I think is the same issue, right? So if you take a look on how states are run in Africa, it is the type of decision authority that is in place within the, let's say, the democracy that was imposed upon Africa, poses a problem, right? So
Mhm.
if you have someone uh, that is coming into power with its external connection, with probably no perspective for the insiders, right? But
Mhm.
trying to do things only for the outside, of the, of the outsiders, this won't work. So once we have a framing of corporate governance that really address the issue of how we can come into power, how we hold the people accountable to what they are doing within this framework, then we can move on. But if we don't have, this is how, the framework that we have here can help, right? So it can emphasize on the current issues that we have, right? So remember the form of visibility. What are the form of visibility in our settings? What are the form of visibility of, the public institution in developing countries? If we make a diagnosis of that, then we can incorporate it in the way we can improve the articulation between the macro level decision and, the organizational level decision. I think this misfits,
Mhm.
it's a real problem in the bundles, right? We have a misfit between the macro level element of national corporate governance and the organizational level. So if we can make sure that we have the right fit, then this can inform the public organization. I think this is a starting point or the reflection that we can have. This is why I think that the framework that we have is useful,
Mhm.
for the conversation.
Mm. And it could be remodeled, actually,
Yeah,
taking
absolutely.
corporate
Yeah,
governance
it's
and
not.
looking
Yeah,
at
yeah. Mm-mm.
putting public governance there. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Anderson. And I'm just going to check if we have further questions. Yes, I think we do not have further questions. So I'm just going to have to wrap up now. So I want
Mhm.
to really thank you, Anderson. It's been a very engaging, very insightful presentation, but I also hope very educating for colleagues that have joined from academia, but also I can see colleagues that are joined from practice, and I hope that that has been helpful. So a big thank you to you, Anderson. Thank you for taking the time to a very busy schedule. And I'm going to draw this to a close now by thanking you and also thanking our attendees. I hope you found these very useful. Now, there's a poll that will be coming up now. Kindly complete the poll before you leave. EOS seminars will continue, and the next one will be in a couple of months, and you will get details of that. So I want to end by thanking you again, Anderson, and hopefully we'll be able to welcome you to Singapore face to face in the future.
Yeah, yeah, I hope so. I'll be delighted to be there. I know a little bit of region, but I haven't get the opportunity, got the opportunity to be there. So yeah,
Great
that will be my
great
pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. That was a pleasure, and it's always a pleasure to present ongoing reflection, right? So
Good.
thank you all your team to your team, right? So
Erica,
it's Erika that is, yeah, Erika is there. So thank you, Erika. Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you, everyone.
thank
Thank you
you.
to the
Thanks.
attendees too. Yeah. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Take care.